Welcome to the AFR Saints channel, where we provide you daily content on your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to leave your comments below and smash that like button. Who dat?
Around the league, the Titans, they're not listening to trade offers. However, there have been phone calls made to both the Browns at 2 and the Giants at 3 with the intention to move up, from several different sources telling me there are teams who are looking to get up in this draft to either the 2 or the 3 spot. The assumption being to move up to the 2 or the 3 spot, it would be for Abdul Carter, Travis Hunter, or the running back, Ashton Jeanty, who everyone expects to go somewhere in that 5 to 7 to 8 range. And those teams are not immediately slamming down the phone. I think the 2 spot gets very interesting if the Browns are listening to a Godfather deal for them to trade back and someone to trade up into the top 3.
That is Peter Schrager on Get Up here on Tuesday morning. And boy, is that potentially complicated, all the scenarios at the top of the draft. Interestingly, this is the closest to the draft in the modern era since 1967 that we have not seen a single trade in round 1. Every team still holds their selection in round 1, 2 days out from the draft. We have not seen that in the modern era since 1967. Are we finally about to see some movement? Ross Jackson, Locked On Saints, and of course, LouisianaSports.net. Good enough to join us for a couple minutes here. How are you, man?
Hey, dude. Doing great. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Okay, so you hear Peter Schrager's report that teams are calling about moving up to the 2 or 3 spot. Cleveland and the Giants fielding those calls. How might that affect New Orleans at 9?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that would end up affecting them there is if they're one of those teams, right? If they're one of those teams that's calling up, trying to make some kind of a big leap up, then obviously that's the biggest impact. I don't think that they're one of those teams. I think they're willing to stand pat at pick 9. But I do think that the other way that this ends up having an impact on them is if one of those teams that's trying to move up to 2 or 3 is indeed actually trying to move up in order to grab Ashton Jeanty. I think that's one of the biggest things that ends up having an impact on them because of the ripple effect that starts. So let's say that Travis Hunter goes off the board at 2, but then the Giants move back from 3 for a team like the Denver Broncos, who are apparently really interested in moving up. They drop all the way back to 20, and then Denver moves up and they take Ashton Jeanty, let's just say. Then you would imagine Abdul Carter would go off the board pretty quickly after that to the New England Patriots at 4. And then you get to this interesting spot at 5 and 6 with Jacksonville as well as Las Vegas at 6, to where, okay, if Jacksonville takes an offensive lineman or if they turn around and take a big defensive lineman, it kind of puts the Raiders in position to potentially take a quarterback in a way that becomes really interesting because, yeah, they could go with the offensive line, but the player they've been most connected with over the course of this offseason so far at number 6 has been Ashton Jeanty. And so if he's not there on the board, what then becomes the opportunity for them to take a Shadur Sanders or potentially take a quarterback that we're not expecting them to take? And then that maybe puts a little bit of pressure on the Saints at 9 to figure out what they want to do at that position, because we're expecting them to potentially trade up later on to go after a quarterback. But if one of the quarterbacks that they really like goes off the board at 6 or sometime at some point in the top 10, then it certainly has an impact on how quickly they might want to strike.
Well, wouldn't that be wild? So
yeah.
So it would appear, Ross, the other big news is all of the odds makers have taken Shadur Sanders' odds of going to the Saints. They've just plummeted, right?
Yep.
So do you think that is more the Saints, the realization the Saints aren't interested in Sanders, or what may happen ahead of New Orleans to where it might make it less likely that the Saints would draft Sanders at 9?
Yeah, I don't think I get to say this very often because I think there's a reason why the odds makers in Vegas have the big buildings and everything, because they make a lot of money doing what it is that they do. But I think this is an example of Vegas catching up with the media as opposed to the media catching up with Vegas. I think this is Vegas finally realizing, oh, wait, there is no interest when it comes to the New Orleans Saints when it comes to Shadur Sanders. And that's something that we've been sort of reporting here for a while. That's something that we've kind of known has been the case for a while, that there really was never this, it hasn't seemed to be, at least, unless they've done a very, very good job lying and covering things up, which would be great for the organization. But there really hasn't been a lot of fodder around to kind of support this idea that the Saints were in on Shadur Sanders in the very beginning. And so Vegas kind of reacted to the Derek Carr situation, maybe even a little bit earlier than that. I think that now this, with the change of the odds, is kind of Vegas saying, okay, maybe there's not that interest. And then so now they're kind of catching up and going, okay, offensive line, defensive line seems to be the spot where they go, because typically that's where they go. 11 of their last 13 selections, first-round selections, have been offensive or defensive linemen. So it makes a lot of sense that that's the route that they could potentially be headed.
Ross Jackson's with us on Twitter at Ross Jackson. NOLA, of course, LouisianaSports.net, covers the Saints for us there, and you can listen to him or watch him, Locked On Saints. So now, Ross, everything is seemingly flipped, where the Saints are a prohibitive now favorite, overwhelming, to take either a defensive or offensive lineman. Mikel Williams out of Georgia is the one who now, currently, this moment, which could change seemingly any minute,
right,
who now has the overwhelming odds to be the Saints' pick at 9. With what you know about Mikel Williams, with what you know about Brandon Staley, how does that marriage seem to work if it were to happen?
Yeah, I think Mikel Williams is one of those guys that's going to be looked at as kind of the, hold your breath when I say this, developmental young defensive end. So this feels more like a Jeff Ireland New Orleans Saints special than it does a Brandon Staley special.
Okay.
But I am curious about how much more successful the Saints might be able to be with a player like Mikel Williams with Brandon Staley than they were able to be with a guy like Dennis Allen. Mikel Williams isn't really the Peyton Turner, Marcus Davenport prototype. He's 6'5", yeah, but he's also only about 250, 260 pounds. He's not a 280-pound guy. And so you can put him with his hands in the dirt, but if you let him stand up and rush, then maybe he's more successful in that situation, and he ends up having kind of a same impact that I would expect to see like Tennessee edge rusher James Pierce Jr. have in Brandon Staley's defense, who I think is like tailor-made for Brandon Staley's defense. And so maybe Mikel Williams is there, but I don't know. I mean, look, they did a private workout with him, and there's a lot of kind of murmurs that he's dealing with an ankle thing from back in the fall, and that maybe his workout wasn't really as kind of enticing as people thought that it might be. And so we'll have to see how that ends up having an impact on him, because, I mean, it's one thing to go for the project guy that maybe fits a different mold. It's another thing to go for the project guy that's also dealing with an injury and injury history. And we know that this New Orleans Saints team hasn't been super successful keeping its players healthy. And so dipping into the already injured pool doesn't really feel like the way to go. It's a challenging one. I could certainly see the Saints doing it. I don't know that it'd be the wisest decision for where they are right now, though.
If it's not Mikel Williams, some of the other names we've seen, why do I always miss Shamar Stewart? And I always miss Shamar Stewart and Shamar Turner. Like the two Shamars from Texas A&M on the defensive line mess me up. Anyway, is it someone like that? Is there a possibility that Mason Graham from Michigan could end up landing at 5? Like, what else seems to make sense there at 9 if it's not Williams?
Yeah, I would say that Mason Graham is a runaway one. Like, if he's there at 9, that's a really easy choice for New Orleans to make, I would imagine. I know investing at defensive tackle in the top 10 is something that'd probably be frowned upon. But look, if you look at the players that are going to be the most valuable around where the Saints are playing, or around where the Saints are selecting, one of them is a defensive tackle, one of them is a tight end, the other one's a running back. This isn't about premium positions here. This is about impact, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, you look at a Mason Graham, definitely makes a lot of sense. Shamar Stewart is one that, that's one of the ones that, I wrote over at LouisianaSports.net. Maybe that's one to avoid. That is too much of a developmental prospect. There's there's a lack of production, 1.5 sacks in all 3 of his seasons, and not without any opportunity while he was there either. Like Mikel Williams maybe was in a bit more of a rotation than a Shamar Stewart was. I think Shamar Stewart with the Philadelphia Eagles is one conversation. Or Shamar Stewart with the New Orleans Saints is an entirely different conversation. But the other players that make sense, Ashton Genty if he were to fall to 9, and then Tyler Warren if he were to fall to 9 as well. I think that those guys on the board, even with a Mikel Williams, would be tempting. Even with a Mason Graham would be tempting. But I feel like Mason Graham is kind of the guy to where if he's there, that's the pick. If he's not there and Tyler Warren's on the board, then I feel like the Saints could just as easily justify going after the big playmaker as they can building the trenches.
Hard to make a bad pick at 9. I mean, we've seen.
There's so many good spots here.
Teams have missed in the top 10, no doubt. But generally speaking, if one of the 10 best players on your board is there, you're you're going to get a starting caliber player in the end, unless you just completely whiff at quarterback, which happens. You're going to get a starting caliber player. So I guess to bring this full circle, where we started talking about the hypothetical that Peter Schrager brought up with the Browns and the Giants fielding trade inquiries, the domino effect you laid out there, Ross, had Will Campbell not going to New England at 4, where he is an overwhelming favorite to land. Is there a scenario where he could be on the board at 9 and maybe the Saints go offensive line with someone like Campbell or Kelvin Banks or another one of the top offensive linemen on the board?
I would certainly say so. And look, if it is Will Campbell, I think that can make a lot of sense for them. I think that that's one of those situations where you just gather your 5 best offensive linemen and figure out who plays where. I think that there is a little something about okay, they invested a first-round pick 2 years ago or a couple years ago on the offensive line. They invested another first-round pick last year. Now they're investing another first-round pick if they were to go that route this year. It kind of says that they failed one of those times. I don't think you did with Talaiasi Fuanga, so it puts a big question mark around what the future of Trevor Penning is. And so I think that it kind of, that would be present in terms of it. But I think building the trenches is never a bad thing, particularly on the offensive side, especially knowing that you're probably going with a young quarterback here in 2025. I think having a solid offensive line helps. I think Kelvin Banks is absolutely a guy that could be in conversation. I wouldn't be surprised about guys like Josh Simmons or Josh Conley even being in conversation if they decide that offensive line is more important than their board, right? And so that would have to be the big thing. Or if their board reflects that these offensive linemen are more highly ranked than what the consensus boards say, which is typically the case, that the consensus boards are always wrong for some number of teams, then you could certainly see the Saints potentially going that way. The other way that trade back ends up having an impact, by the way, is that if, let's say that Cleveland moves all the way back to 20, and then they take at 20 one of the quarterbacks that New Orleans might look to trade up for at the back half of the first round, it also has an impact on their pick number 40 and their ability to be able to move up. Because let's say that they're really in on Jackson Dart, but Jackson Dart goes to that team at 20, and then another quarterback goes to Pittsburgh at 21, and all of a sudden there's no quarterback left for their board to trade up for, then maybe it keeps them from moving back into that first round. That's the other kind of ripple effect side of this too that I kind of am writing about right now. That ends up having not only an impact at 9, but an impact on that potential second first-round pick as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. You can read it over at LouisianaSports.net. Of course, everything at LouisianaSports.net is free. No paywalls, no memberships, no freemium. Everything is free over at LouisianaSports.net. You can read Ross there. Of course, you can listen to him or watch him. Podcast, YouTube, Locked On Saints. Great time to get connected there if you're not. Okay, man, I'll let you get back to it. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, bud. You take care. Stay safe. Talk to you soon.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact. And be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.